today's video I'm going to talk you through how to remap the lighting functions on new Athearn Genesis locomotives to work with the ProtoThrottle. I love the ProtoThrottle. I've had this for over a year now. It gives you great prototypical operations, and one of the things that a lot of modelers don't realize is when you're using the lighting functions on locomotives, the manufacturers have them set up to where the headlight and the rear lights are directional based upon the direction of the locomotive. Some guys use that to figure out what direction the locomotive is heading. If the rear lights are on, they know it's in reverse. If the front lights are on, they're going forwards. This is not prototypical operation. With ProtoThrottle, we have our light knobs down here, and on the prototypical locomotive, the headlights are always on regardless of whether the locomotive is moving forwards or reverse, and it's a safety feature, it's a spotting feature for other locomotives, pedestrians, drivers, etc. So in previous videos I've talked you through how to map a Tsunami 2 decoder to be mapped to the ProtoThrottle. That method has worked for a very long time up until I got this locomotive, what you're seeing, Illinois Central 3140. It's produced as an Athearn Genesis GP50, even though Illinois Central called this a GP40-3. This is a new release. It was released in, I believe, June or July of this year, and I could not get the lights to map up the way previous Tsunami 2 decoders had worked. So this really put me into a lot of fits because I wasn't able to use my ProtoThrottle to run this locomotive because the lighting functions were not working how we were typically programming them with the ProtoThrottle. So after about 2 to 3 weeks and with a lot of help, I was able to figure out what the cause of the issue was, and now I'm going to walk you through how to program this locomotive to get the lights to work correctly with ProtoThrottle. So this locomotive particularly was problematic because this one has operating forward and rear ditch lights, and out of the package, the default presets for the CVs, the ditch lights were mapped to function 5. So if you press F5 on your hand throttle, the ditch lights would come on, and again, out of the box, the default operations were if you put the locomotive in reverse, the headlights and the ditch lights would reverse, and the rear headlight or rear light and ditch lights would illuminate. Again, this is not prototypical operation. On previous decoders, and you'll see that I'm cutting away here to a still shot, I had to take the shell off the locomotive to be able to figure this out. Previously, the front headlights were always wired to the FX3 and FX4 outputs on the decoder, and if it had rear ditch lights, those were mapped to FX5 and FX6. So there were, in addition to the F0, where the headlights and the rear lights were wired to, there were 4 additional lighting outputs on the Tsunami decoders, and the ditch lights were mapped to FX3, FX4, FX5, and FX6. As you can see by this particular image, that the front ditch lights are mapped to F7 and F8, which are function 7 and function 8 on the lighting output. That's great, but all of the soundtracks and Athearn manuals still say that the front lights are wired to FX3 and FX4. So this threw me into a pretty sizable amount of confusion. I thought maybe this was just a quirk on this particular locomotive, that it was wired incorrectly in the factory. So I contacted Athearn. They were not a whole lot of help, and then about a week ago I was able to pick up UP4141 and 9096, which are 2, again, brand new, released by Athearn SD70 models. They had front operating ditch lights, same types of scenarios. The ditch lights weren't responding to the remapping of the ProtoThrottle, so I pulled the shell off of 9096 and come to find out that the front headlights or the front ditch lights were wired to this F7 and F8 output. So now I've pretty much eliminated the problem down to that Athearn or Soundtracks has basically updated their decoder and they are now wiring the front ditch lights to something other than what we had been able to figure out. I usually run all of my locomotives through JMRI, and I did a very comprehensive review of the CVs, and I could not find anything that showed where the front ditch lights were wired to, because these new FX7 and FX8 didn't have CV values that were able to show up on JMRI. So really, this became a pretty sizable mess to sort through, but we're able to figure it out. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through step by step. I'm actually going to do a complete reset on this particular decoder, and I'm going to walk you through everything step by step on how I get this configured for the ProtoThrottle. So from what I can tell, and again, I have not seen any official documentation from Athearn, I believe this change occurred somewhere in the summer of 2019. I'm just wondering if it corresponded to when Athearn switched over to LED lights. If you can remember, Athearn is one of the final manufacturers to switch over from incandescent bulbs to LEDs on their locomotives, and I'm just wondering if this change coincided with Athearn switching over to LEDs. Nevertheless, if you have purchased a locomotive somewhere in late 2018, 2019, and you're trying to map it to the ProtoThrottle, I would recommend reading the CV values, especially 1.250. Read 1.259, 1.260, 261, 262, and 263 to see what they are showing, and I'll talk through that as I remap this locomotive. Okay, so I'm going to start here using my Digitrax hand throttle. I have a separately wired programming track. If you've watched my videos, you know I have a separate programming track that it's either operated with JMRI or with my command station. So here I'm going to start with my command station. If you have never reset a decoder, here's a pretty simple way how you do it. Hit the program button on your control panel. We're going to find CV8. We're going to set this to a value of 8. Hit enter. Sorry, enter is just a little bit out of the screenshot here. Okay, so now to get this completely reset, we have to put the locomotive back on the track and cycle the power on and off, so I'll show you that here now. Okay, so now I got my locomotive here, so we're going to hit the exit button to get out of the programming mode. Now I'm just going to turn the power on. Now we're going to immediately cut the power off. We're going to let it set here for a few seconds. Now we'll go ahead and turn the power back on. So this should reset it down to the default address of 3. So I have 3 pre-programmed in already. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the plus to turn the track power back on. So immediately it starts with the startup sequence of the locomotive. I'm going to go ahead and mute this. We'll just double check the functions here. So F0, see the headlight comes on. F5, ditch lights come on. Check the reverse, even though the camera's not on the rear of the locomotive. I'm just going to walk over here and verify it. The rear lights and the ditch lights are on in the rear of the locomotive. So we have successfully reset this decoder to factory default settings. So I'm going to go ahead and kill the track power here. And now we're ready to walk you through step by step on how to program this locomotive. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, since it's defaulted to the address of 03, we're going to go ahead and change that to the 3140 road number. So again, we're going to go ahead and enter program mode. So originally it comes up with the last CV that you wanted to change. So I'm going to scroll that down to where it says AD2. I'm going to press the right knob to get us to a 4-digit address. I'm going to make sure it's taking, so I'm just going to type in 3140. Hit enter. It's going to say 4-digit address, click yes. Okay, now that we got the 4-digit address selected, I'm going to select CV value of 3, which is the acceleration. I set these based upon my preferences. You can modify these however you want to. A CV value of 200 is going to delay the locomotive moving after you apply throttle to it, very prototypical. 4 is deceleration. I max this out at 255, which is the highest value that you can put into a CV. And basically what this means is as you turn the throttle down to 0, or essentially coast, the locomotive still has momentum and it's not going to stop the second you move the locomotive. The next thing we're going to do is change CV value of 31 to 16, because this allows us to get into the indexed CVs, which are 1.257, 1.258, etc. So we're going to change this up to 1.2, whoops, no, that's not what I wanted. I want 257. So 257, since CV31 is a value of 16, imagine this is 1.257. 1.257 is the function number for the headlight, and this, I'm actually going to hit the display button, it'll read it. So right now that this is mapped to function 0. 1.258, let's read this one. It's also 0 because it's directional. These are the rear lights. So what I'm going to do with this, the first function that is not set in this locomotive is function 19. So I'm going to go ahead and program 1.258 to 19. I'm going to hit enter. So we've just mapped the rear light to function 19. Here's where I got confused. 1.259 on every other locomotive. I'm going to read this. This is FX3. And you can see this is currently set to a function of 24. This is what got me confused. The front ditch lights turned on with function 5. So logic would dictate on old locomotives, if the ditch lights were mapped to FX3, this should read 5. It was reading 24, and I could not figure it out. So currently, and if you remember from the picture that I showed you, that there are no wires wired to FX3 and FX4 in the decoder. So basically they just assigned these two as blank functions, 24 and 25. Took me forever to figure this out. 1.261, I'm going to read this one, is set at function 5 because these are the rears. And again, that makes sense because when function 5 was on, the rear lights would come on. So now I want these separate from function 5, so I'm going to make this 6. 262 is also the rear. I'm going to make this 6 as well. So now the rear ditch lights will turn on when function 6 is turned on. So this is not in any of the manuals yet, and this is where it's confusing. So now the front ditch lights are mapped to 1.263, and I'm going to read this, and that's going to read function 5. 264, I'm going to read this. It's also set as function 5, so that is correct. We want to keep the front ditch lights at function 5. Those two CVs are set, and that's where, once I got that part figured out, we were good to go. So now we're done with the headlights on this and the ditch lights. Now we have to make them not respond to when the locomotive goes into reverse or not. The two functions that control whether or not the lighting is reversed is CV57 and CV58. Now previously, and you can take a look at this picture here that I'm showing you, the front and rear lights were bits 0 and 1, FX3 is bit 3, FX4 is bit 4, FX5 is bit 5, FX6 is bit, I think I got off there. Anyway, you can take a look at the picture here and see what we're doing. But if you notice on this picture from the manual, bits 6 and 7 are blank on this particular CV. So in my mind, since they've added FX7 and FX8, that this should fill bits 6 and 7 on this locomotive. So then if you go ahead and calculate this up, I'm going to leave bits 2 and 3 blank at 0 because FX3 and FX4 aren't mounted to anything, that gives us a value of 243. So now I'm going to go ahead and program bit 57 at 243. And I'm also going to program bit 58 at 243. So now the front and rear lights should be non-directional, meaning when you hit function 0, the headlight will come on and stay on. When you hit FX5 or function 5, the front ditch lights will come on and stay on. Function 19, the rear light, headlight will come on and stay on. And then function 6, the rear ditch lights will come on and stay on. So now I can map them to the ProtoThrottle, which we'll get to here in just a second. Now the other thing that I love to take advantage of the ProtoThrottle are the brakes. Athearn has these defaulted to have the train brake, or the independent brake as a default off. So to set that, we have to change CV of 1.403 to a value of 0. So let's read it and what it is right now. The default CV value was 12 on that, so I'm going to go ahead and make this 0. So this now will allow me to select or enter what I want the brakes to be. The independent brake function is controlled by function 117. So we'll go ahead and do that. And again, this is another one where the values are up to you to play for how quickly or how slowly you want the train to stop. Again, I like a little bit more control, so I do kind of max this out. And I have a completely other video on my channel explaining the braking. But right now I'm going to set this to a value of 255. So now we have the light setup, the momentum setup, the deceleration setup, the braking setup. And there's one last thing I'm going to change before we go ahead and program the ProtoThrottle. And that is on these Tsunami decoders, the Tsunami 2 decoders, they take advantage of the DDD, or the DDE, which is the dynamic digital exhaust. And they try to simulate load. So if you give a lot of throttle to the locomotive, the RPMs go up probably 2 to 3 notches higher than what the actual prototypical notch would be. And then to simulate, how the motor revs up to pull a heavy load. And then as it gets going, the RPMs come down to the notch that you're supposed to be in. Using the ProtoThrottle, it's actually counterintuitive because when you go to notch 1, the locomotive revs up to a notch, probably 2 or 3, and then it comes back down. So I'm actually going to disable that by disabling the digital dynamic exhaust. So those are controlled by functions 511, and you do not have to do this, by the way. To me, this is just something I do to get a little bit more prototypical operations with my ProtoThrottle. We're going to set 511 to 0. We're going to set 512 also to 0. And then we're also going to set the true idle, which is 112. And I'm actually going to read the CV. So it's currently at a value of 7. To get this to work correctly, we have to add 8 to this value. So I'm going to read this and make it 15. Okay. So that's all the programming I'm going to do using my Digitrax hand throttle, and this will get you everything you need to do to be able to get your locomotive to work properly with ProtoThrottle. So I'm going to show you just a couple things on JMRI. These again are completely optional for you, but these are just a couple things that I do just to give me a little bit better operations for my train room. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and click on sound levels. The sound levels on these locomotives when they come out of the package, from my perspective, the Athearn's, it's very loud. So I usually adjust the master volume control. I'm going to adjust the prime mover down just a little bit more. The room that I'm in, it's a small, probably 12 by 15 room. These are too loud, unfortunately, so I just play with the volume here. Again, you can actually change these on CV values I find that harder to do because it's easier to just slide these scales. So once you make your changes, you can click on Write Changes on Sheet. And then the other thing I do really quickly is I'm going to go ahead and click on Function Labels. Nope, I'm sorry, Function Map. Function Map. So I'm going to come down. If you scroll down, one of the things, I've never understood it, but what do I know? If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, actually I must have missed it. Okay, cab chatter, it defaults to F7. F7 is the exact same function that the mute is on. So right now, every time you turn your light throttle or the light switch on your ProtoThrottle to dim, you're going to hear the cab chatter. So I'm going to go ahead and disable that. I'm going to write that change. So this way you can leave it, it doesn't matter, but certainly the cab chatter piece is something that every time you put it on dim, you hear the cab chatter. It's a personal preference that I don't like. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do, I clicked on the sound tab. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change this engine auto start enable to disable. So basically what that means, I'm going to write that change. Basically what that means is when you turn the track power on, the prime mover goes through its startup sequence on the ProtoThrottle. If you map this, if you disable it, the only way to get the prime mover to work is either give it a throttle, a click on your hand throttle, or you can hit the RPM plus or minus to get it to engage. So if we come over here and take a look at the function map again, you can see that RPM plus is function 26 and RPM minus is function 27. That will turn the prime mover on and off. So I'm going to map them to the ProtoThrottle. So those are the only CV changes I'm going to make with JMRI. Again, these are pretty minor changes. You can change CV values, but for me it's just a little bit easier to change them with JMRI. So now let's go ahead and program the ProtoThrottle to use with locomotive 3140. Okay, so you can see I got my ProtoThrottle running and connected here. So you can see that I'm in S003, so this is an empty slot for me. So the first thing we're going to do is we'll go ahead and start clicking through the top left button, and we're going to set the locomotive. And again, this one, and we're going to use the right buttons here. This is 3140. Then the bottom left saves it. Let's go ahead and set our configurations. So our horn is F2, our bell is F1, brake is F11, and again you can take a look at the function guide that comes with your locomotive for where these are. Some of these are remaps and I'll get to here in a second. Brake off, we're going to leave. Auxiliary, which is this button right up here, I'm going to program this to straight to 8, which is function 10. Engine on, if you remember, we disabled the auto start, so to get the engines on to work, I'm going to program this to F26. Engine stop is going to be F27. Throttle unlock, we're going to leave blank. Reverse swap, we're going to leave blank. Forward headlight or front headlight, function 0. Front ditch, remember we made these function 5. Front dim 1 is F0, and front dim 2 we're going to program as function 7, which is our dimmer. Same for reverse, we made the rear light as function 19. Rear ditch is 6. Rear dim 1 is going to be 19. Rear dim 2 is 7. Our up button, so that would be what this button is right here, top right. We're going to make that the mute button. So right now it is the MOM, which is momentary, so when you hit it, it goes quickly. So like for the horn, we want to make this a latched function, so just scroll all the way through your functions until it gets to latched. To mute it, that's F8. The down button, we're going to make this our coupler crash, and again we want this to be a latched function because you hit it once, it makes the coupler crash. You hit it a second time, it's the air release, and that will be function 13. And then that takes us back to the beginning. So then you can go ahead and push this button here to save it. A couple other options here, variable brake. You can play around with this. I usually have the variable brake on. Pulse type, let's go back and change that. Emergency brake, I want to make sure that that is set to be off, because that when you move your brake lever all the way over to the right hand side, it engages the emergency brake, and I want that set as off. A couple other things I'm just going to check real quick, like I'm going to check the notch configuration. So in this particular unit, if you notice on JMRI, this is set to notch up every 7 notches, so it should go 7. We're going to play with this here. Go back to notch configuration. So 7, go back to 2, which will be 14. Notch 3 will be 21. Notch 4 will be 28. Notch 5. Going to test me to see if I can do my math here. Multiples of 7. 35. Notch 6 will be 42. Notch 8, or I'm sorry, notch 7 will be 49. And you'll want to play with this because you'll get a pretty decent matching of your sound every time you notch up. And notch 8 will be 56. Again, this is all personal preference as well. Okay, those are saved. We are ready to take this for a test run. Okay, we're going to go ahead and run through a startup sequence here. So let's go ahead, hit the top button to initiate it. Check the lights. Dim, bright, bright plus ditch. Check the horn. Bell. Give it a little throttle here. Brake. Okay, we're going to check out the rear lights here. Dim. Bright. Ditch. Put that back in reverse. We'll just check. Top button should mute it, which it does. Bottom button should be the coupler crash. And hit it again to release the air. 10 is the straight to 8. Mute that real quick. So there you have it. Start to finish showed you how to reprogram this locomotive. Again, I would pay real close attention to any locomotive you get from Athearn with the factory installed Tsunami 2. They are doing some different things with the lighting. I'm hopeful that it's currently September 2019. I'm hopeful that they come up with some revised documentation or manuals that really describe this, because it's, as I mentioned, it's been a little bit of a struggle to try to get this to be to get the bugs worked out to get it to work correctly with the ProtoThrottle, but I did, and I hope you found this video helpful. Please comment if you have any questions. Thank you.